Hey everyone, it's Livestream City here at the New Stack. We had all the buzz going with our lightning demos this morning, and now it's time for the roundtable. And I am lucky to be joined by some of the most accomplished people in the media, analyst, and tech biz. Joining me today, first of all, is Joab Jackson, managing editor of the New Stack. Hey, Joab.
Hello.
And also joining us is Rachel Stevens, an industry analyst at RedMonk. Rachel, great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. Hi, everyone.
All right. And moving on to Katie Gamanji, cloud platform engineer at American Express and CNCF Technical Oversight Committee. Great to have you here.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
You bet. You know, earlier we were testing things out. It was the first time I've ever been in a discussion where the background noise is from Docker clusters running in the background. How apropos, your Kubernetes clusters running Docker. That's right. And so then we also have the well-known writer and journalist, Linux pro, Stephen Vaughan-Nichols, contributing editor, CBS ZDNet, and also writing for us here at the New Stack. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Good to see you all.
So we had these demos this morning, and there were all these new projects that you started hearing a lot more about. And one of them that I'm really interested in is OPA, the Open Policy Agent. And I'm hearing also discussions out there about the difficulties it is just to be able to automate all the things. And we're seeing a much greater need for adaptability. And there's discussions about how do you make things self-heal. Are we really at that point, Stephen, where distributed architectures are so immense that the complexity is so great that we need this level of automation? And what issues does that surface?
Oh gosh, are we at well, we would love to be able to automate all that good stuff. Yes, and OPA is certainly a step in that direction. I'm not so sure though that we're really ready for that yet. I think that in particular, security concerns me a lot with Kubernetes because we've pretty much have gotten a lot of things right with Kubernetes. I mean, about 6 out of 10 container instances are now running on Kubernetes wherever you go. But, we still have trouble with security and some other issues like, what mesh to use. So we're getting there, but I'm not counting on being able to just flip a button and ta-da, you've got Kubernetes clusters running everywhere securely, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. In other words, if you're in DevOps or you're a system administrator, you don't have to look for another job quite yet.
Rachel, what kind of jobs are people filling that are you're seeing it in the developer experience realm? I mean, what kind of problems are people having? I mean, I think I was getting a little bit too advanced there. You can get caught up in the buzz a little bit. What's really happening?
Well, I think. Oh, I'm not muted. Okay, I did it right. Sorry, everyone. I do think that one of the things that's amazing about Kubernetes is that it is extensible and modular by design, and that has some really powerful advantages to create kind of the tool space that each individual company is looking for and needing. The challenge that comes along with that is that it can be really difficult to cobble together the entire platform with all of the resources that you need in the correct configuration that you need. So that is, I think, both a challenge and a kind of by design nature of Kubernetes issue that we are all trying to grapple with. And that extends to both the operations of the platform and then the way that we have developers using the platform. And I think in an ideal world, we'd love to get to a state where developers don't have to care at all about the implementation of Kubernetes and can just focus on building their own applications. But that's another area where I don't think we're quite there yet.
Wait a second, Katie. I thought it was supposed to be boring by now. I thought Kubernetes was supposed to be boring by now. I thought the plumbing was done.
Absolutely not. There is so much to do around Kubernetes, including optimizing some of the operations, because Kubernetes, as mentioned, is a very good platform you can build on top of. You can bring in new technologies to connect with it. We really can cater for some of your requirements within a company. However, nowadays we are looking to optimizing to actually move away to better ways of improving the developer experience, of improving the way we have these interoperability principles all over. So I think there is definitely a lot of new projects on the horizon, especially the ones which are actually trying to move into incubation stage or graduation stage at the CNCF at the moment. And there is definitely a lot of interest when it comes to the edge. We are all about to run this super kind of close to the location components to make sure that we have the kind of the better experience for our customers as well. So there's a lot of things we would like to further improve and a lot of projects that will still be developed in the future.
Joab, what's on your mind? What kind of questions do you have?
Well, it's the developer experience, as you had pointed out. I think maybe this year at KubeCon, what I'm hoping to see is a lot more of the work that's being done on top of Kubernetes to package Kubernetes, package the capabilities of Kubernetes for developers and also for routine administrators. I mean, operators were a first stab at that, but I think they kind of ran into their own complexity issues as well. We've been following a lot on the other almost kind of unrelated applications, though, applications built on top of Kubernetes to package the capabilities for developers. Crossplane is a good example of that. Rudder is another one, and they're both built on the open application model, again, which came up through the Kubernetes ecosystem. And also there's GitOps going on as well. And this is kind of an approach to make Kubernetes not only easier for the developer, but for the admin as well. So, yeah, I'm starting to see KubeCon as, I remember that the Cloud Native Computing Foundation likes to put on, tell us that it's not just KubeCon, it's KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon. And I think we're starting to cross over from KubeCon over to CloudNativeCon. I mean, there's still the core plumbing work that needs to be done, but I think the show tent is moving increasingly towards accommodating, the software vendors out there and the large enterprises that need to work with Kubernetes.
Yeah, I love thinking about cloud native kind of as like a wrapper terminology for a whole bunch of different patterns and practices that people can think about. So cloud native doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be running in a cloud. You can have cloud native practices running on-prem, or as Katie mentioned, it can be running at the edge. And so thinking about that evolution of what can cloud native mean, and it's really just thinking about like kind of the patterns that emerged in the era in which cloud came into its own. But a lot of these kind of API-driven architectures and patterns that we encapsulate with containerization are applicable across environments. And I think it's really great that conversation is expanding.
I know there's someone who has some thoughts here. I would love to just hear from Katie. I mean, when you hear about these concerns and what is it that we should be hearing from the themes we should be hearing from the TOC, and what are you all talking about? What are some of the big issues there that you're hoping to see followed up on at KubeCon?
I think, especially considering that the KubeCon Europe was quite close to the KubeCon NA, just a couple of months away, I think some of the problems or the issues we've been trying to solve, we're going to propagate them or try to propagate the solutions for these problems in the KubeCon NA as well. Now, what I actually mean here is that we have streamlined the sandbox application process for multiple projects. So we want to, when it comes to actually be part of having that open collaboration space and not necessarily be part of the CNCF, well, it's part of the CNCF, but in the experimental stage. That's actually quite an important distinction. We made it easier for the projects to enter that ground and actually have a neutral ground for their growth and to see if the community really wants to adopt this kind of capabilities. There are a lot of including the TOC at the moment, there are a lot of things we'd like to improve when it comes to incubation and graduation stages, especially now that the ecosystem is growing and it's quite mature. We'd like that to be kind of referenced through our kind of guidelines to move these projects forward as well. But when you're talking about the specific technologies we'd like to see on the roadmap, this is something we don't necessarily set in stone. This is something which we would like to see more within the landscape. We would like to see more projects to actually have the genesis within these areas. I think there is a lot of movement around chaos engineering. There always has been a movement about how can you manage failure, how can you introduce failure on purpose, but more importantly, to learn from them and make sure that you'll be ready when an actual failure happens. So there have been great projects out there. However, I think there is still a lot to improve. I think some of the good offerings have been from the vendors, but nothing stood out, which is like, yes, this is the project we'd like to completely introduce within our cluster. As I mentioned, projects which are currently getting mature within the Edge side. So we had Cubase, which moved to incubation. Great project as well. Would like to see that moving forward as well. GitOps was mentioned as well. We had Argo CD, which moved to incubation as well. I think Argo has a lot of kind of good shots out from the community. And there is this collaboration between Red Hat and Intuit, which are planning to contribute more to the project. So I'm really excited to see this kind of, how can I say it, funding and in terms of human resources to this kind of project. So it's great to see this kind of collaboration throughout. So when it comes to the TOC, we're trying to, all the time we're trying to streamline the process to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of how can they move forward and actually be part of the community. And in terms of the roadmap, we would like to see this kind of new emerging technologies, and we'd like to see more projects within those areas. Because when it comes, for example, to observability, I think it's a very well-known space. There's a lot of projects out there. I think the community has a very good collection to really choose from rather than be stuck with one tool. When it comes to provisioning, again, there is a lot. Networking runtime, there is a very well-grounded areas. We'd like to see this kind of similar growth in other areas as well.
I hear all this, but sometimes I think we're still at a stage, though, where we're putting the cart in front of the horse, because one of my concerns about Kubernetes is security. And when I look at security in Kubernetes, I still see some pretty just fundamental issues here. For example, lots of people say they don't do it, but I know they darn well do, which is they just grab a hold of the most popular Docker images or whatever they can find, and they just use them without even looking at it. And as Dirk Handel of VMware, he's their VP there and Chief Open Source Officer, he said recently, container packaging format is a lot like .exe in Windows or .dmg in Mac OS, where you just ship everything with all the dependencies included. But they're binaries. You don't know what's in there. How can you really trust that it's there? Thinking about that on another level, what about those containers, Linux kernels underneath them? To really secure them right, that means you should be locking them down with AppArmor or SE Linux or some other system that uses a mandatory access control system. And people seem to be pretty lame about doing that too. It's a lot easier in the short run just to grab some containers, whether that some Joe says they're a great container, and then run it on some Linux that you don't really have locked down, and, surprise, bad things will happen. Things are improving in some ways, like now in Kubernetes, I think it was 1.8, you can now use role-based access control to make sure that your users have some sense of what, the overall administrator has some sense of what the users can and cannot do on various instances and clusters, because before that, could get really messy. Another point which comes to mind is Kubernetes secret objects, which contain things like passwords, OAuth token, I always say this one wrong, OAuth tokens, SH keys, and so on. And but unfortunately, those are stored in etcd, and if you get etcd, isn't encrypted. Therefore, neither are your secrets, and you really have to enable encryption at rest and restrict access very closely. And it just can be difficult. I know some users also keep their secrets in JSON or YAML, where they're encoded, but encoded is not the same thing as encrypted. I mean, I can break base 64 without breaking into a sweat, and so can anybody else. It's just, I just worry about a lot of this stuff. Andrew Martin, who co-founded Control Plane, Kubernetes security business, he actually wrote in the documentation itself that, write access to the API service etcd is equivalent to gaining root. And he's not wrong. And there are things you can do about that, like you should configure them with peer and clients TLS certificates, deploy them on dedicated nodes, and so on. I guess my point about all this is, though, that if you're in security, none of this is new. This is pretty old, basic stuff. But in our hurry to advance to these new, higher levels of doing things, I think that, unfortunately, a lot of us are ignoring some of the basic security foundations that we're building all this stuff on. And that's what I have to say.
I would say that I agree with the concept that software supply chain security is still a really big need in the ecosystem right now, and helping people get well vetted and well audited components for their software. So we talk a lot about wanting things to be reusable, but making sure that we have kind of approved components from third-party open source, and that we have active and remunerated open source contributors who can actually maintain all of that software in a reasonable way. Like, all of those things are still very open questions. And so as that applies to security, I definitely agree that those are areas where we as an industry have work to do.
I could only echo this kind of concerns, and I think they're very valid concerns. And this is why because we've seen Kubernetes adoptions quite heavily in enterprises who are greenfield. They don't have pretty much heritage infrastructure out there, and they can build something from scratch. They choose Kubernetes and they can integrate multiple things with it, which is great. But when it comes to actual enterprises, we see a slower adoption rate to this. It's not away from it. They look at it, they really understand the benefits of having something which is containerized, having something which actually has the ability to reconciliate, to have a very well-integrated CI/CD, to use the best of GitOps and so forth. So I think the companies see this kind of benefits, but they are very cautious of moving towards that space, mainly because of these security concerns. And I think this is definitely an area which could have a better kind of visibility and a better set of tooling to administer all of this. But at the same time, I think there is good steps through. I think there are good, especially at KubeCons, there are good talks on the security track, which addresses some of these issues. They try to attack Kubernetes. Even the bounty program, I think that was a good thing to further kind of encourage people to break Kubernetes. And based on that, they would be able to further to create a better suite of how can you make a Kubernetes more proof, if that's the thing, more bulletproof. I just wanted to echo that. And this is definitely something which has been seen in the industry as well in terms of the adoption rate.
One of the things I'd like to see is, I know NIST, that's the U.S. Standards Agency, they've typically done guidelines for government, but also for industry on, how do you secure your VM? How do you secure, they have a nice a set of guidelines for securing containers, which touches on some of the issues that Stephen has talked about. But I guess we're still waiting for one for Kubernetes. I think that's the important one. So once we get these basic industry-wide guidelines, I think that would help enterprises quite a bit in knowing what are the base precautions to put into place.
I want to add to that. You actually reminded me, just very quick, there is an actual white paper from the SIG Security, which was actually it's on my list to read. I think it was released earlier on this week on Monday or something like that. So it's still something I need to read through. But there is already some guidelines from the SIG Security that actually do provide some kind of, I wouldn't say advices, well, the kind of advices, how to be able to implement security at different levels. So I definitely do recommend to read through that. I have to do it myself, so I cannot elaborate further on that, but it's definitely something you could look into to understand this concept of security better.
Now, if I might interject too, at the conference itself on Tuesday, I think is it, let me look at my calendar. Yes, November 17th. Cloud Native Computing Foundation is having a Cloud Native Security Day. It's additional registration. Do it. If you're concerned about security, that would be the one day I would be sure to be there. If you have security concerns about Kubernetes, and you should. Listen to what the real experts have to say. Take what guidance you can from the seminars that will be presented, because this is useful information that you will need as you go on your Kubernetes journey, which I will also add, if anyone out there is listening now and you're not using Kubernetes now, you will be. I mean, it's as simple as that. I don't see any other container orchestration system out there having a remote chance of overtaking Kubernetes at this point. It's becoming the de facto standard for container orchestration.
I want to just add here that I want to, first of all, thank the Cloud Native Computing Foundation for putting on the KubeCon event and for making this discussion possible. It's a big help to be able to have these discussions before the KubeCon event. One of the things that I'm thinking about, for instance, and we're going to be having a pancake breakfast on this topic, is identity and access management. And there's so many different ways to think about identity now, and there always have been, really. But now we're really seeing it kind of come to fruit in this world where we're living in an API universe, and there's much more. There's just so much more activity that we have to be aware of and think about. A service can have its identity as much as anything. And so I'm wondering what the blocking and tackling is that we're starting to see to help kind of manage this issue, because this becomes a problem for developers knowing what to trust and what not, and it gets into questions about the direction of service mesh and other approaches. So, any thoughts here from anyone?
I think one interesting thing that we saw come out very recently was from HashiConf and their introduction of their new boundary project to try to help people work on how to interject kind of authentication and authorization as separate concepts and have that user and identity-based access control connect better to your TCP resources. And so I think there are definitely lots of interesting things happening on this front, but I think as the kind of number of projects are continuing to explode, it indicates that we haven't figured it out all the way yet. But I think there's definitely some interesting things happening on the security and access front.
Yeah, that boundary project, that's the first time I've seen that. I guess the first sort of solution I've seen that easily connects the developer desktop to the actual cloud native resources. You don't have to, up until now, you had to go into a private network or you had to use SSH and, all the resources, the containers are moving around, so you didn't have an IP number. This was an interesting approach that offered Terraform as a way to keep track of all that at a higher level and make it easier for developers. And I think that's what you'll hopefully we'll see a lot more are these security solutions that are interfacing with the actual enterprises, and then leave Kubernetes as way down in the stack where you don't have to worry about it.
Katie, when you're working at American Express and thinking about these types of issues, how are you approaching issues like identity and access management?
Well, in this particular context, I think security is something which is very well thought of. It's managed by a separate team. That's the thing. At the moment, when it comes to security, I think everyone should have a part of responsibility. Anything you integrate, make sure that you test it thoroughly to understand what you're actually deploying. As mentioned before, like people just take Docker containers, Docker images, and they just put them in a container and run it, whilst they actually have to understand what's happening, what kind of dependencies it consumes, and if those are safe and so forth. So when it comes to American Express, there is a completely different team managing our security concerns. We have guidelines from them, but at the same time, in terms of our infrastructure, because we are part of the One Infrastructure team, which takes pretty much the role of enabling different functions within and operations within the American Express for the developers. Now, you can think about this as a team which kind of closes the gap between the infrastructure and the actual application teams. Well, in short, I think it's very well known as a DevOps role, if you could refer to that in that perspective. But I think from this perspective for us, when it comes to security, it's something which we try to address thoroughly. And if you try to push the production, we have a kind of set of rules we need to comply with. Now, saying that, I think American Express is still on a journey to maybe implement some of the more cloud native kind of principles when it comes to security as well. And I think there is a lot of heritage kind of connections between different applications. But saying that, there is definitely an appetite to move towards like kind of better systems, well, not necessarily better system, but systems which will solve the problems of the futures, because that's what all the companies are concerned about. How can we actually manage those increased loads? How can we actually manage those large customer base and so forth? So I couldn't give you a very specific answer either, but this is pretty much what is our relationship from our team's perspective with the security.
Are you seeing, Stephen, and I'll let you continue, but let you speak, but are you seeing an intersection of infrastructure as code and policy at all?
I was thinking about something entirely different, so I can't give you an answer on that. What I can say, though, is perhaps a lot of people are not aware that Kubernetes does not map well to traditional identity structures. You can't, for example, identity in Kubernetes is how you relate to a set of APIs. You can't easily hook up with Active Directory or LDAP, or I don't think OpenID is supported either. So it's a very different sort of approach. And so you really need to, when you look at authentication and identity, you really need to take a hard look at exactly what Kubernetes does and put out of your mind how traditionally you might approach it, and learn how Kubernetes handles these things, and then decide whether or not you want to try to map it yourself in some other way to your traditional ways, or you want to just get to this, used to this new API-driven sense of identity, which varies considerably on any given moment, depending on what clusters you're using and so on.
Yeah, that was the approach that the Boundary took, was you map it to the service ID rather than the actual IP number, which is always changing around anyway.
Right.
Well, one of the questions that that's come up with this is how do you think about identity overall in Kubernetes? And if you can't, there's some concern how you think about identity in and outside of Kubernetes. And what if you have to think about that as an issue, where, when you're thinking about, the way that you kind of can store the identity itself, the identity in that management, from that management point of view, there seems to be a lot of issues here that might be able to be solved even with hardware, but that's another conversation entirely. Go for it, Stephen.
Well, I'm just Gosh, this is, I don't want to get into a lecture, but Kubernetes does use, instead of what we normally think of as identity, they use service accounts. If someone who knows Kubernetes better than I do, please override me. So while Kubernetes in and of itself doesn't store information about you as a user, it does store a service account, which you then interact with to do, whether you want to just submit a very basic pod or whatever. But again, it's a very different kind of approach than normal identity. And it's something that you just do need to work on. You can use service identities with role-based access control, which, again, that sounds like user identity, aren't you? But it's not really quite the same thing. I recommend anyone who's concerned with these issues, and again, I think you should be, to take a long, hard look at how Kubernetes handles identity, and you need to learn about it, because again, a lot of the preconceptions you may walk in to running Kubernetes aren't going to hold up when it comes to identity.
Well, let's move on to another topic then, and I'd love to focus more on the developer experience then. With Rachel, what are some of the top topics that you're going to be interested in learning about at this next KubeCon when it relates to the developer experience?
Yeah, I think one of the things that everyone is really hungry for is trying to figure out, like, we as an industry have a tendency to do the right once and run anywhere promise over and over and over again. And I feel like there really is that hunger, though, to be able to deploy to a variety of distributions or environments, and regardless of where your application in Kubernetes is running, actually have it be able to be deployable from your desktop to wherever it needs to go. That's why I think the Crossplane project from Microsoft is super interesting to watch, to be able to kind of write translators from a spec and have it run across an instantiation of different services. So I think it's a lot of those things of just trying to take some of the pain out of the configuration, out of being able to kind of not muck around in the details, but just focus on where the value is in the application is where we are spending time focusing.
Configurations, Katie, is that a topic of interest for you at American Express? Is it otherwise?
Absolutely. I think for the teams I've been working with, in my previous role in American Express, I think there is a very strong accent put being on developer first, which means we really need to cater our platform for our developers. Now, when we're talking about that, that means how they're actually going to deploy to the platform. And this includes the system you bring. For example, the CI/CD system is extremely important because there's going to be the first layer of interaction with the cluster that a developer is going to see. And there is a definite kind of interest to simplify that process as much as possible. Now, I think at American Express, we have a suite of tooling already, but we're trying to build on top of it to actually simplify. However, I've been seeing a lot of movement when it comes to, again, I'm going to mention Argo CD as well. It really kind of provides this automatic reconciliation where you don't really need to care about the underlying cluster. Well, you can actually see the resources. It's a visualizer as well. It's quite a kind of important cue to understand what's happening with your resources and see how they're moving around. And on top of that, it provides a very good UI and a very good abstraction layer when it comes to configuration and templating. Now, saying that, there's still a fair amount of YAML an engineer would need to be aware of when deploying to the cluster. Even if you have a templating layer such as Customize or Helm, you still need to be aware of some of the values you need to inject or some of the deep merges that will require some configuration files and so forth. And definitely there needs to be a better abstraction layer for that, to truly focus on that application-only layer. I wanted to mention something else, but I forgot this at this moment. But I definitely think this is an area of interest. Oh yes, one other thing I wanted to mention when it comes to the dashboard. I think so far we've been missing to see one tool which will allow us to see Kubernetes in action, to actually have that UI. And I think like to actually have these wrappers around your kubectl rather than doing them on your command line, you'd be able to do that for a dashboard. There have been a lot of providers that offer that, but nothing consistent throughout. And I want to mention Octant, which is a UI for actually exploring your Kubernetes. And I really like Octant because you can put it on top of any cluster. You can provide a point of presence for your cluster, so you'll be able to see everything. Because nowadays, you don't have only one cluster, so you're going to have at least 5 to 10. That's if you have one environment in one region. Depends on how many replications you have across the world as well. But it really provides that point of presence for all of your clusters and the same way of interacting throughout. And I'm saying that because at Condé Nast, when I was there, we didn't have such a tool. We actually had to implement it from scratch. So I'm really glad that they're actually contributing this kind of capabilities to the community. And it's good for the developers, but the same for administrators as well. So just wanted to shout out that project.
O-P-T-A-N-T? Octant? Or how do you spell that?
Octant. With O-C-T-A-N-T.
Oh, Octant. Okay, great. Okay. Well, before we finish out, I'd love to just kind of maybe get a round of just thoughts and perspectives about what you're going to want to learn from KubeCon. We've heard a lot of those, but anything you haven't mentioned so far, Steve? I know you're focused on security. Is there any other topics of interest for you when you see this? I'm interested in the particular distributions that we're going to see, what advancements we're going to see in the distributions themselves. Is there any uniformity in these distributions? Are we starting to see more of a balkanization of cloud services? How they approach Kubernetes, and does that make the dream of the multi-cloud really something that we really shouldn't be thinking about? But that's kind of one of the thoughts I have. But Stephen, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, I don't see balkanization happening yet. I think that the potential is there, but so far the Cloud Native Cloud Foundation is doing a pretty good job of keeping everybody all focused on interoperability. And I hope that's going to continue to be the case, because once you start dividing up into incompatible versions or distros or what have you, everybody ends up suffering. If you can't, for example, take your clusters and on that run on OpenShift and move them to, I don't know, a Mirantis cluster or a canonical cluster, then you've got trouble. And it's not so much, I think, as multi-cloud as, the promise, the hybrid cloud is you'll be able to move things easily from one place to another. And Kubernetes will be sort of like the magical bridge that will actually enable us to do that. And that sounds like almost like fantasy to me, because I've been at this business for a really long time, and the promise of interoperability very seldom lives up to the reality of interoperability. But I really do think that with Kubernetes, we are finally going to be at a place where we will be able to have true interoperability between not just Kubernetes distros, but between various cloud infrastructures underneath them. That's my hope. I think it would be a much better technology world for everyone out there who uses the cloud, if that does indeed prove to be the case.
So I guess I'd like to ask Katie, in terms of, one thing, there's a difference, I think, between the distributions that each company develops, each service develops, and the CNCF kind of being on top of managing that. So there's that. But every cloud service is different, in the experience that you actually have in the cloud service. So is there any, is that something that is on your mind? Are there other matters on your mind? I'm curious because there's an experience, to me, a little bit of a gap there on how you can work with different services.
I see. This has been something which I've been concerned for the past 2 years. When it comes to creating a cluster, you usually have a completely different experience if you're going to use a cloud provider or if you're going to self-manage your clusters. Yeah. Everything is just astray, like there is not one user path. And I think every single cloud provider, they're going to offer their packaging and they're trying to get absolutely good on optimizing this user journey. And if actually going to a cloud provider is something a company would need, or they have the funding to do that, that's absolutely right. The other thing I want to mention, if you're thinking to have self-managed clusters, there is a tool that I've been exploring quite heavily. That's going to be Cluster API. Now, why I want to shout out to this particular project is the fact that it provides one interface, and you'll be able to integrate into different clouds by using the same or you're using your manifest with a very high ratio. So from that perspective, I think Cluster API has gained a lot of kind of momentum and is still kind of climbing the mountain towards having that wider adoption. But I definitely think it's a tool which will streamline that developer experience that we've been mentioning of provisioning your clusters moving forward. There's actually going to be a talk that I'm going to give at KubeCon, which is a deep dive into Cluster API. And one of the things I'm doing, because this particular tool to define your cluster within YAML manifests. So you don't have Terraform, you don't have Ansible, you're actually going to have YAML manifests for your clusters. So it makes the best use of CRDs. Now what it actually means, the demo that I'm going to showcase, if you have YAML, that means you have templating. You can have customizer Helm on top of it. And if you have this kind of templating, you can use a tool such as Argo CD to kind of auto-reconcile any changes you have to your clusters. So I think this particular area has come very far. I think there's a lot of new benefits to kind of exploring this area and maybe try to reconsider the way you provision your clusters or contribute to the tool and so forth. But from this perspective, I definitely want to highlight that there are good projects. There is definitely new kind of control planes trying to streamline and optimize the way you provision your clusters.
Rachel, any thoughts on that or other thoughts for what's on your mind?
So I think at RedMonk, we focus a lot on the developer experience, and a big part of that in the Kubernetes world is any project that works to standardize interfaces like Katie's talking about. So we will watch those with interest. And I think the other thing that we just have our eyes on is any kind of efforts that we see from projects or vendors to try to tell that broader contextual story, not of just a piece of the puzzle that they are solving, but how it kind of fits into the broader narrative of how to improve the developer experience overall. Because I think right now we have a really disjointed tool chain that can be difficult to manage because everyone kind of has solved for individual pieces, but there's still a lot of gluing that needs to happen to get everything to work together. So any kind of broader steps to integrate tool chains is also something that's really interesting to us.
Joab, any story ideas coming out of this?
The thing about these conferences is that the issues you think you're going to see going into them are not the ones that actually get discussed at the show themselves. So you never can tell. One thing I will be looking at is the multi-cloud story, and to the extent that Kubernetes can support multi-cloud operations. Whether or not that's a good thing, again, that's another topic. But, we're starting to see, both, Azure and AWS and Google start to ramp up on making Kubernetes easier to use, which is a big issue. I think last month Azure released a pause button, or the equivalent of a pause button, if you wanted to start and stop your clusters really easily through a single command. And I think we'll see more of that, and it'd be interesting to see that tension between the features that are specific to one implementation of Kubernetes in the cloud or otherwise versus the desire to keep it independent and above the competitive fray.
Well, I want to thank you all for taking the time to talk today and giving us a little bit of a heads up on KubeCon, which is coming up in mid-November. I want to give a big thanks to our sponsors, the people who make KubeCon possible, the folks over at CNCF Stephen, Rachel, Katie, Joab, thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much.